We may be missing the point entirely. While the press briefings are counting intercepted drones and destroyed radar installations, China is running a parallel operation that costs Beijing nothing, requires no missiles, and is producing intelligence that will be used against American forces for the next 20 years. Trump is, in effect, broadcasting the full operational playbook of the United States military to Beijing in real time. Every munitions depletion rate, every stealth aircraft performance metric, every gap in carrier strike group coverage, every political fracture point that causes an alliance to splinter, China is logging all of it. And it is doing this while simultaneously proving, under live combat conditions, that its sanctions evasion architecture is robust enough to sustain a full military embargo. The system China built over a decade was never really about Iran. It was about Taiwan. Iran is just where the grading happens. Let's start with the energy strategy, because the foundational assumption behind this entire military campaign is wrong, and the numbers make that inescapably clear. The narrative in Washington goes like this: take out Venezuela's oil exports to China, then take out Iran. Squeeze Beijing from both ends. China's economy buckles. America wins the great power competition without fighting China directly. It fits on a bumper sticker, and it is factually, numerically wrong. China has achieved an energy self-sufficiency rate of 84%. For every unit of energy China consumes, only 16% comes from abroad. That number has been rising for 20 years as a deliberate matter of state policy. Massive investment in solar, wind, hydropower, nuclear, and the largest electric vehicle fleet on the planet. China's renewable energy production now matches its coal output. Within that remaining 16% of imported energy, oil makes up about 59%. Of China's total oil imports, roughly 17% comes from Iran, averaging between 1.38 and 1.61 million barrels per day. Run those numbers all the way through, and you arrive at a figure that should make every architect of this war lose sleep. China's dependency on Iranian oil represents approximately 1.5% of its total energy consumption. 1.5%. That is the lever Washington thought it was pulling. Here is what the strategists either don't know or refuse to acknowledge publicly. China has constructed a shadow fleet representing roughly 18% of total global tanker capacity that operates entirely outside standard regulatory frameworks. These vessels reflag mid-voyage, disable their AIS transponders, and conduct ship-to-ship transfers in obscured waters off Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam to rebrand Iranian crude as Omani or Malaysian before it enters Chinese customs data. Since 2022, Chinese customs has officially reported zero direct oil imports from Iran. Tanker tracking firms using satellite imagery confirm 1.38 million barrels per day still flowing throughout 2025. Intelligence estimates put approximately 300 million barrels sitting on shadow tankers right now, a floating strategic petroleum reserve. Combined with onshore strategic storage at 100 to 115 days of net import cover, Beijing has a buffer that absorbs months of disruption regardless of what happens at Hormuz. Now, here is where the strategy turns from merely ineffective into actively self-destructive. Look at who actually depends on the Strait of Hormuz. Japan sources 91% of its oil through that waterway. The Philippines, 94%. South Korea, roughly 70%. Taiwan, the country at the center of the actual strategic competition, is heavily dependent on Gulf energy. 20 million barrels flow through Hormuz daily, and 80% of that volume is headed for Asian markets. Professor John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago put it precisely. He said it is Japan and South Korea that are going to be clobbered because they are more dependent on Gulf oil than the Chinese are. He then added the dimension that should alarm every European watching this. The Europeans are already in serious trouble because they are not getting oil and gas the way they used to from Russia. Now cut off the Middle East flow on top of that, and you can see exactly where European economies already struggling are going. The United States set out to weaponize the Strait of Hormuz against China. What it actually did was conduct an act of economic friendly fire against every energy-dependent ally it needs for its Pacific strategy. Daily charter rates for tankers carrying Middle Eastern crude to China soared above $400,000. Brent crude broke $110 with projections of $150 or higher if the strait stays closed. And Venezuela, that first punch everyone celebrated, Venezuelan oil is still being sold to China. The only difference is that the United States is now doing the selling through offshore accounts following Maduro's capture. The profits changed hands, the oil did not. Meanwhile, China is accelerating negotiations for the Power of Siberia 2 natural gas pipeline with Russia, using Moscow as a land-based energy safety valve to offset Middle Eastern volatility. The crisis is catalyzing exactly the outcome Washington spent years trying to prevent: a secure Eurasian energy corridor between China and Russia, built on the wreckage of the Gulf region America just destabilized. Now let's talk about the military campaign itself, because even setting the energy calculus aside entirely, the battlefield picture is more sobering than the briefings are communicating. Operation Epic Fury launched February 28th with nearly 900 coordinated airstrikes in the first 12 hours. B-52s, stealth fighters, two full carrier strike groups. The first 24 to 36 hours cost an estimated $5.2 billion. And a significant portion of that $5.2 billion was spent striking decoys, precision-guided munitions costing hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars each, launched at targets that turned out to be elaborate fakes. The Iranians had prepared for this for 30 years. They moved, dispersed, hidden, and planted dummy infrastructure across the country. The United States fired first and verified second. Analysts are calling it the Battle of Decoys. No official briefing has used that phrase. Here is what makes it worse. The Pentagon knew this was coming. For 3 decades, under Bush, Obama, and Biden, the military establishment fought back against Israeli pressure to go to war with Iran. In 2024 alone, Israel tried twice to draw Biden into a direct confrontation, once in April, again in October. Biden refused both times. General Kane, the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs, reportedly warned President Trump before February 28th that the United States did not have a viable military option. Trump ignored him. Netanyahu told the president what he wanted to hear. The regime is fragile. One hard blow and it crumbles, just like Venezuela. And Trump, as one analyst put it, took the bait. The decapitation strikes partially succeeded. Khamenei is dead, but here is the critical failure that the architects of this war did not account for, and that Mearsheimer has articulated with particular precision. The historical record is unequivocal. There is no example in modern warfare of an air campaign alone producing regime change. Not Korea, where the US firebombed the North into rubble and it did not quit. Not Vietnam. Not even Japan, where the firebombing of Tokyo in a single night in March 1945 killed more people than either atomic bomb, and the Japanese still did not surrender until the Soviet ground invasion of Manchuria in August. Most historians attribute the Japanese surrender to that ground offensive, not the atomic bombs. If you want regime change in Iran, you need boots on the ground. Iran is 4 times the size of Iraq with 93 million people, and even this administration understands that putting an army into Iran would be catastrophic. So the campaign is being run with the one tool that history says, without a single exception, cannot achieve the stated objective. Iran has at least 45,000 missiles remaining and estimates of 50,000 to 100,000 drones. A friend of mine in the defense industry described a recent Iranian drone. Sheet metal, simple guidance, costs a few $1,000s to produce, maybe tens of thousands for the more capable variants. The United States is firing multi-million-dollar interceptor missiles to shoot them down. That is the exchange rate of this war. The United States started this campaign with roughly 8,000 to 9,000 high-end precision munitions and has probably burned through close to half. Patriot missiles are not artillery rounds. You cannot surge production overnight. Replenishment takes months. The Iranians understand this math. So does Beijing. The feedback loop nobody in Washington has properly reckoned with is the supply chain for replacement systems. The rare earth minerals and gallium required to build new missile guidance components, the semiconductors, the precision materials. China controls those supply chains. The country we are attempting to constrain through this strategy controls the materials required to rebuild the weapons we are burning through to constrain it. China's 2026 defense budget rose 7%, specifically according to Beijing's own public budget documents, to exploit the dynamic in which adversaries deplete precision inventories faster than their industrial bases can replenish them. The Iranians have destroyed over 27 U.S. bases across the Gulf region. They have taken out virtually all long range early warning radars in Israel and across the Arabian Peninsula, the systems designed to give early warning of incoming attacks. They are doing this using precision strikes guided by China's Beidou 3 satellite navigation system, which remained fully functional after the United States jammed GPS across the entire theater. When the United States jammed GPS during the 12-day war in June 2025, Iranian accuracy degraded. The lesson was absorbed. China transferred Beidou 3 access to Iran before this conflict. Beidou 3 has 45 operational satellites compared to 24 in the American GPS constellation. Its military-grade signal includes frequency hopping and authentication measures that make conventional jamming significantly harder. Its accuracy margin is under 1 meter. The jamming that worked in June 2025 did not work in March 2026 because China changed the navigation infrastructure Iran was using. China also supplied the YLC-8B anti-stealth radar, a UHF-band system specifically designed to reduce the effectiveness of radar-absorbent coatings on F-35s and B-21 Raiders. The U.S. Navy, with 2 full carrier strike groups deployed, still cannot escort commercial traffic through Hormuz. In the 1980s, when America ran a similar convoy operation called Earnest Will, it had a 600-ship navy. Today, it has 8 Arleigh Burke destroyers and 3 littoral combat ships committed to the theater. Now let's talk about the 5 lessons the PLA published, because Beijing publishing them publicly was not an oversight, and what they did not publish matters more than what they did. The People's Liberation Army posted a public analysis of 5 lessons drawn from the Iran war. That is a deliberate signal to Washington, to Taiwan, and to every regional military watching. Lesson 1. Internal intelligence is decisive. The surgical elimination of Iran's leadership was only possible because Israeli human intelligence had agents embedded inside the country who knew locations, schedules, habits. They knew where Khamenei was. They knew other leaders were meeting in daylight on the assumption that attacks would only come at night. China looked at that and saw a direct mirror. Espionage prosecutions in Taiwan have surged from 16 cases in 2021 to 64 in 2024. Beijing is already running that playbook against Taipei. It also noted the CIA's recruiting video targeting disgruntled PLA officers caught up in Xi's anti-corruption purges. The paranoia this creates in an autocratic military system either produces purges that gut operational competence or produces a command structure so suspicious of its own officers that decision-making slows to a crawl. Lesson 2, Washington uses diplomacy as a setup, not a process. Trump was negotiating with Iran. Reports indicate Iran had agreed to zero uranium stockpiling and full verification in the days immediately before the bombs fell. He ran the same sequence with Maduro. Talks one day, special forces the next. Chinese state media published an editorial after the strike stating that diplomacy under Washington is not a forum between sovereign equals, but an instrument of dominant power. A former Chinese military officer said publicly, "Do not assume your adversary will play by the rules. They may strike without warning, ignoring both the rules of the game and the rules of war." When Xi meets Trump at the end of this month, whatever warm words are exchanged publicly, this lesson will be at the table between them. Lesson 3, hard power determines outcomes regardless of moral framing. Xi has been saying this for years. China's defense budget rose 7%, with nuclear-powered carriers, drone programs, electronic warfare platforms, and aerial refueling vessels all accelerating toward 2027 readiness targets. Chinese analysts also concluded that China must prevent Japan or the Philippines from becoming what they are now calling the Israel of East Asia, a U.S.-aligned regional partner capable of being used as a military staging platform for operations against China. Lesson 4. Tactical success and strategic victory are not the same thing. You can destroy air defenses in the first hour and still not achieve your political objectives 2 weeks later. Mearsheimer argues that Netanyahu's actual goal may not be regime change at all. It may be to fragment Iran the way Iraq and Libya were fragmented into ungovernable states that no longer project regional threat, regardless of who nominally leads them. But even that outcome requires sustained destruction the United States cannot afford politically or financially. Beijing wants Taiwan reunified, not converted into a rebellious occupation, generating international condemnation for decades. Lesson 5. Self reliance is not an ideology, it is survival. Iran pursued it for decades in energy, arms manufacturing, and alternative financial systems. It was not enough against the full weight of the US military, but China is not Iran. It has the industrial base, the technological depth, and the scale. Its Beidou satellite system just proved its resilience under live combat conditions against American jamming. That is validation under fire. Every system China provided to Iran in this conflict is being graded in real time against American capabilities, and the results are being fed directly into PLA operational planning for a Taiwan scenario. What the PLA did not publish, and what matters more than all 5 lessons combined, is the full intelligence harvest from watching this campaign in operational detail. Operation Epic Fury is a proxy stress test for a Taiwan contingency, munition depletion rates, carrier strike group patrol patterns, stealth aircraft performance against integrated air defense, political cohesion thresholds before an allied coalition splinters. Every precision strike provides data on how the U.S. approaches the degradation of hardened military infrastructure. If the sanctions evasion architecture China built over years, the Shadow Fleet, the CIPS payment system, the Zhuqin conduit, the M-Bridge digital currency platform, can sustain commodity flows to a state under full military embargo, then Beijing has validated in live conditions the exact mechanisms it would need to sustain the Chinese economy during a blockade over Taiwan. Both Russia and China have enormous strategic incentives to ensure that the United States suffers a humiliating outcome in Iran. As Mearsheimer has noted, the U.S. is a strategic adversary to both, something Putin and Xi understand perfectly but are smart enough not to advertise. Russia is providing significant intelligence. China provided the navigation and radar infrastructure before the war started. As time passes, that assistance will only increase. Now we get to the part of this story that should genuinely concern you, because the most dangerous weapon in this conflict is not a hypersonic missile. It is a financial instrument most people cannot define. The global derivatives market carries a notional value estimated between $600 trillion and $1 quadrillion, roughly 10 times the size of the entire global economy. The collateral backing that entire edifice is estimated at around $300 billion. For every dollar of real money in the system, there are roughly $2,000 to $3,000 in derivative positions riding on top of it, and a disproportionate share of those positions are tied to energy prices. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange reported record-breaking volumes in energy contracts in the first week of this conflict. People were not trading. They were scrambling to cover positions designed for a world where oil costs $80 a barrel, not $110 or $150 or $200. The CME flagged the extraordinary activity. The question nobody at the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, or the ECB is asking loudly enough is what happens when the counterparties cannot pay. Iran knows exactly what happens. Tehran has been operating outside the SWIFT banking system for decades. It built offshore companies in Dubai. It learned to navigate shadow financial networks. And it learned to play the derivatives market itself, placing bets on the volatility it is generating. When Iran attacks tankers in the Strait, it is not only disrupting shipping, it is moving energy prices on the CME. When it strikes fuel storage at Salalah, it is triggering insurance recalculations, freight surcharges, and cascading repricing across every commodity market connected to energy inputs. Iran's military command has announced the end of its policy of reciprocal strikes. The posture is now continuous operations. Their message, get ready for $200 oil. Qatar's leadership has warned publicly that they are weeks away from an economic disaster, invoking force majeure clauses to halt LNG production because storage has no remaining capacity. The UAE shut down the world's largest refinery, not because of a direct strike, but because there is nowhere to put the output. 25% of the world's oil is currently offline. 35% of global fertilizer supply, which depends on Gulf petrochemical components, is disrupted. If oil breaks $150, knockout clauses in derivatives contracts begin triggering automatically. Banks that wrote those contracts discover they cannot cover their exposure. It is the 2008 insurance analogy run in the energy market. Every counterparty is exposed simultaneously, and the institution standing at the center files for insolvency. Except the institution in this scenario is the Western financial clearing system. Mearsheimer described the range of outcomes plainly. You could have a worldwide depression, or you could have something less severe, a global recession with enormous consequences, especially for developing countries that cannot absorb the shock. The importance of oil to the international economy simply cannot be overstated. And the Trump administration understands this. They said publicly that plausible stories could be told about how this becomes one giant nightmare. That is not a quote from a critic. That is the administration's own framing of the risk. Now consider what China built while the cameras were pointed at the missile launches. CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system, is processing 928 billion renminbi in daily transactions, approximately $128 billion per day, flowing through a financial messaging system the U.S. Treasury cannot intercept, freeze, or monitor. That is not a pilot program. It is a functioning alternative to swift processing real transactions at scale. Project M-Bridge, the multi-central bank digital currency platform involving China, Hong Kong, Thailand, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, surged past $55 billion in transaction volume by early 2026. Because it uses a decentralized ledger for peer-to-peer settlement, a digital yuan transaction between an Iranian entity and a Chinese buyer is essentially invisible to American financial surveillance in real time. The Juchin conduit channeled an estimated $8.4 billion in 2024 through a closed-loop oil for infrastructure barter arrangement. Iranian crude to Chinese buyers, funds deposited into the vehicle pays Chinese engineering firms to build airports, refineries, and railways inside Iran. No dollars cross a border. No transaction touches the American financial system. Western surveillance is blind to it. China promised Iran $400 billion over 25 years in their 2021 Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. The actual capital delivered has been minimal, and deliberately so. Beijing calculated that a sanctions-constrained Iran is a permanently compliant partner. If Beijing fully capitalized the Iranian economy, Tehran might recover enough sovereignty to diversify its relationships. By keeping Iran on a subsistence-level lifeline, Beijing guarantees that 90% of Iranian crude exports go to a single buyer. That is not a partnership. That is a monopoly wearing the clothing of strategic alignment. There is one more dimension that determines what happens after the shooting stops, and it is the Gulf states. They were not consulted before February 28th. They were not part of the decision process, and they are paying a catastrophic price. Their ports are under attack. Their oil infrastructure is being targeted. Their desalination plants. Anyone who has worked in Saudi Arabia knows that cities like Riyadh are almost entirely dependent on desalination, are potential targets in an escalation spiral neither side can fully control. The bases that were supposed to protect these countries have turned them into magnets for Iranian ballistic missiles. The interceptors that were supposed to shield the Gulf are reportedly being diverted to Israel. Before February 28th, the Gulf states were already hedging. Saudi Arabia formed a strategic partnership with Pakistan, which explicitly stated it would extend its nuclear umbrella over the kingdom. Turkey sought to join that arrangement because Ankara is worried about American reliability for exactly the same reasons Riyadh is. Both Saudi Arabia and Turkey watched the US Israel combination use military force in the region with no advance notice and asked the obvious question, who says they will not use it against us next? Israel struck Qatar in the past year. The Americans did not protect Qatar from that strike. The Gulf states drew their own conclusions. China saw this opening years before the bombs fell. In March 2023, Beijing brokered the restoration of diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia after a 7-year freeze, achieving what decades of American regional engagement had been unable to accomplish. Chinese exports to the Middle East grew at twice the rate of Chinese exports to the rest of the world in 2025. Chinese direct investment in the region between 2019 and 2024 approached $89 billion. Beijing is selling Gulf states sophisticated drones and air defense systems without the human rights conditions attached to American weapons. The post American Gulf is not a forecast, it is already underway. Operation Epic Fury accelerated it by a decade. So, where does this leave us? The United States is fighting a 21st century conflict with 20th century assumptions. It assumed air power would produce regime change. The historical record says it never has without ground forces. It assumed Iran would fracture. The population is instead rallying around the state, as populations under bombardment have done in every conflict from Korea to Vietnam to the London Blitz. It assumed disrupting the strait would damage China. It damaged American allies and validated everything China built. It assumed the financial system could absorb the shock. The full shock has not yet arrived. The Iranians are not looking for an off-ramp. They have leverage and they know exactly what it is worth. They want sanctions relief, probably reparations, and a binding guarantee against a repeat. In less than 1 year, Iran has been attacked twice. They are negotiating from the position of a country that closed 20% of the world's oil supply using mines and drones and watched every American ally refuse to show up. Colonel Douglas Macgregor called this the last act in the American theatrical production in the Middle East. When this ends, he said, we will be finished there. There will be no restoration of the status quo. We will simply leave, and everyone in the Middle East will want us out. Mearsheimer went further, describing a strategic pattern of a country addicted to the use of force, depleting its own arsenals, straining its own alliances, and handing the patient adversary the time and the data it needs to close the gap. The people who will not pay the cost of any of this are the ones standing at the podiums. The ones who will pay it are the family at the gas station paying $8 or $10 a gallon. The retiree whose pension fund is one oil spike away from insolvency. The young family that cannot afford groceries because fertilizer costs tripled and the harvest came in short. So I will leave you with one question, not rhetorical, a real one. Are you ready for $10 gas and a Western financial crisis in exchange for a military campaign that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs said was not viable before the first bomb fell? Think about that. And if this analysis gave you something the evening news did not, subscribe. The scenarios we cover here are the ones that will not appear on television until it is already too late to prepare for them.